This 1858 portrait of this plantation family hides a secret that has only now been revealed. Dr. Maya Thompson had been working as a curator at the New Orleans Museum of Southern History for 12 years, and she thought she had seen every variation of antebellum portraiture that existed. Stern patriarchs standing beside their wives, children arranged by height and age, occasionally an enslaved servant positioned in the background as a display of wealth. The photographs were always composed the same way, rigid, formal, designed to project prosperity and social standing. But the portrait she discovered on a humid September afternoon was different in a way that made her breath catch in her throat. The museum had recently acquired a collection from the estate of the Beaumont family, one of Louisiana's oldest and wealthiest lineages. Their sugar plantation, Belle Rive, had been one of the largest in St. James Parish before the Civil War. The collection included business ledgers, personal correspondence, and several dozen photographs spanning from the 1850s through the early 1900s. Maya was cataloging the photographs methodically, documenting dates, subjects, and any identifying information written on the backs. Most were exactly what she expected: stiff, formal portraits, images of the plantation house, occasionally a photograph of the sugar processing buildings or the fields during harvest. Then she opened a leather portfolio containing a daguerreotype dated 1858. The image showed a family of 3 posed in an elegant parlor. The man, identified on the back as Charles Beaumont, sat in an ornate chair, his expression stern and authoritative. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, well-dressed in the formal style of the era. Beside him stood his wife, Marguerite, her hand resting on his shoulder, wearing an elaborate gown with a wide crinoline skirt. Her expression was softer than her husband's, but still composed and proper. Between them, seated on a small cushioned stool, was a child of perhaps 2 years old, a little girl with light curls, wearing a white dress with lace trim. The child looked directly at the camera with the unfocused gaze typical of toddlers being made to sit still for the long exposure time required by early photography. But it was the 4th figure in the portrait that made Maya lean closer, her heart beginning to race. Standing slightly behind and to the left of Marguerite was a young black woman, perhaps 20 years old. She wore a simple dark dress with a white collar and apron, the uniform of a house servant. Her hands were positioned carefully at her sides, her posture perfect. Her face was beautiful, with high cheekbones and a graceful neck, her hair covered by a white headscarf in the style common for enslaved women of that era. And her eyes were fixed on the child with an expression of such raw, desperate longing that it seemed to radiate from the photograph itself. Maya had seen hundreds of images of enslaved people in antebellum portraits. They were usually positioned as background elements, their faces carefully neutral, their gazes averted or unfocused. They had learned to make themselves invisible, to show nothing that might displease their enslavers. But this woman was not invisible. Her eyes told a story that Maya instinctively knew was extraordinary and heartbreaking. She turned the daguerreotype over carefully. On the back, written in faded brown ink, were the words, Charles, Marguerite, and little Caroline Beaumont, with Rose. Belle Rive Plantation, June 1858. Rose. The enslaved woman had a name. Maya photographed the daguerreotype from multiple angles, then carefully secured it in archival storage. But she could not stop thinking about those eyes, about the emotion so clearly visible in Rose's expression. Something about this portrait was not what it appeared to be, and Maya was determined to discover what the something was. Maya spent the next week unable to focus on anything except the Beaumont portrait. She had placed a high-resolution scan of the image on her computer and found herself returning to it repeatedly, studying every detail, trying to understand what made it so different from the thousands of similar portraits she had examined over the years. It was not just Rose's expression, though that alone was remarkable. It was the positioning of everyone in the frame. In most plantation family portraits that included enslaved servants, the servants were placed at the edges, literally marginalized in the composition. But Rose was not at the edge. She was integrated into the family grouping, standing close enough to Marguerite that their skirts nearly touched. And there was something else. The way Rose's body was angled, the way her hands were positioned. Maya had seen that posture before, but not in portraits of servants. She had seen it in portraits of mothers standing near their children, that unconscious lean toward the child, that protective stance. Maya pulled up every other photograph in the Beaumont collection, looking for Rose's face. She found her in 3 other images, all from the late 1850s and early 1860s. In each one, Rose was positioned near little Caroline. In one photograph from 1860, Rose held the child in her arms. In another from 1862, she stood behind Caroline, her hands on the girl's shoulders. The relationship between Rose and the child was clearly significant, but Maya needed more information. She began searching through the other documents in the Beaumont collection, letters, legal papers, business records. The plantation ledgers listed enslaved people by name, age, and assigned work. Maya found Rose listed in the 1858 ledger. Rose, 19 years, house servant, nursemaid. That explained why Rose appeared so frequently with Caroline, but it did not explain the intensity of emotion in that first portrait. Maya contacted Dr. James Mitchell, a colleague at Tulane University who specialized in the history of slavery in Louisiana. She sent him the scanned images and asked if he could help her access additional records about Belle Reve Plantation. James called her back within 2 hours. Maya, this is fascinating. I have been researching the Beaumont family for a project on sugar plantation economics. There is something unusual about their family history that you need to know. What is it? Charles and Marguerite Beaumont were married in 1850. According to church records and family correspondence I have seen, Marguerite had several miscarriages in the early 1850s. By 1856, it was generally accepted in their social circle that they would not be able to have children. There are letters from Marguerite's sister expressing sympathy about their situation. But they had Caroline, Maya said. Yes, Caroline appears in records starting in 1858. Birth announced in the local newspaper, baptized at St. John the Baptist Catholic Church in Edgard, legally registered as the daughter of Charles and Marguerite Beaumont. You said legally registered. What does that mean? James was quiet for a moment. Maya, I think you need to look very carefully at that portrait. Look at Rose's face, then look at Caroline's face. Really look. Maya pulled up the high-resolution scan and zoomed in on the two faces. Rose's features were clear despite the limitations of 1858 photography. High cheekbones, a straight nose, full lips, large expressive eyes. Then she looked at Caroline. The child's face was softer, less defined because of her age, but Maya could see the shape of her nose, the set of her eyes, the curve of her cheekbones. The resemblance was there, subtle but unmistakable once you looked for it. Oh my God, Maya whispered. Exactly, James said. I think Rose was not just Caroline's nursemaid. I think Rose was Caroline's mother. Maya sat in stunned silence, staring at the portrait with new understanding. Rose's expression was not that of a devoted servant caring for her employer's child. It was the expression of a mother looking at her own daughter, a daughter she could never claim, never hold as her own, never acknowledge in any way that mattered. How is this possible? Maya finally asked James. If Rose was Caroline's biological mother, why would the Beaumonts claim the child as theirs? It happened more often than most people realize, James explained. When enslaved women gave birth to children who were light-skinned enough to pass as white, particularly if the father was the enslaver himself, some families would absorb those children into the white family structure, especially if the white couple was childless and desperate for an heir. You think Charles Beaumont was Caroline's father? I think it is very likely. Sexual abuse of enslaved women by their enslavers was endemic throughout the antebellum South. If Rose became pregnant by Charles, and if the baby was born with light skin, and if Charles and Marguerite had been unable to have children of their own, it would have been convenient for them to simply claim the child as theirs. Maya felt sick. And Rose would have had no choice but to watch her own daughter be raised as someone else's child. No choice whatsoever. She was property. She had no legal rights, no ability to object, no recourse of any kind. After hanging up with James, Maya spent hours searching through the rest of the Beaumont documents. She found Caroline's baptismal record from June 1858. The entry listed Charles and Marguerite as the parents, with no mention of any unusual circumstances. She found the birth announcement in the St. James Parish newspaper. Mr. and Mrs. Charles Beaumont are pleased to announce the birth of their daughter, Caroline Elizabeth, born May 15, 1858. But she also found something else, a letter from Marguerite to her sister, dated April 1858, a month before Caroline's supposed birth. The letter was brief and cryptic. Dearest Anne, Providence has finally smiled upon us. By the time you receive this letter, we will have the child we have prayed for these 8 long years. Charles insists that no one must know the true circumstances. We will raise her as our own, and she will never want for anything. I confess I feel both joy and a strange guilt I cannot name. Please pray for us. Maya read the letter 3 times, her hands trembling. The true circumstances? Marguerite had known. She had known that Caroline was not biologically hers, and she had participated in the deception. But what had happened to Rose? Had she remained at Belle Reve, forced to serve as nursemaid to her own daughter? Had she been sold away to hide the evidence? Had she survived the Civil War and emancipation? Maya needed to find out. She began searching through post-war records, looking for any trace of Rose. Freedmen's Bureau records, census data, church registers, anything that might tell her what had become of the woman in the portrait. It took days of searching, but finally Maya found something. In the 1870 census for St. James Parish, she found a listing for a woman named Rose Beaumont, age 31, occupation listed as laundress. The surname caught her attention. Formerly enslaved people often took the surnames of their former enslavers, but seeing it confirmed in official records was still striking. The census listed Rose as living alone in a small house on the outskirts of the town of Letcher. about 5 miles from where Belle Reve had been located. Maya cross-referenced the address with historical maps and found that the house was on land that had once been part of the Belle Reve plantation property. She found Rose again in the 1880 census, now 41 years old, still working as a laundress, still living alone. And again in the 1890 census, though the details were sparse due to the fire that destroyed most of those records. But then the trail went cold. Maya could find no death record, no grave marker, nothing to indicate what had happened to Rose after 1890. While searching for Rose, Maya also began tracing what had happened to Caroline. The girl's life was much easier to document. As a white woman of wealth and social standing, her existence was thoroughly recorded in newspapers, church records, and legal documents. Caroline Beaumont had grown up at Belle Reve, educated by private tutors, as was customary for wealthy plantation daughters. In 1875, at age 17, she married Henri Dufresne, the son of another prominent sugar planting family. The wedding was announced in the New Orleans Times-Picayune as one of the social events of the season. Maya found photographs of Caroline as an adult. She had grown into a beautiful woman with delicate features and light brown hair. Looking at these later photographs, Maya could still see traces of Rose's features, the shape of her eyes, the curve of her cheekbones. But Caroline had lived her entire life believing she was the biological daughter of Charles and Marguerite Beaumont. Or had she? Maya found a journal among the Beaumont papers, a small leather-bound book with Caroline's name embossed on the cover. It appeared to be a diary from Caroline's teenage years, spanning from 1870 to 1875. Most entries were typical of a young woman of that era. Descriptions of parties and dresses, complaints about her studies, romantic speculations about young men she had met. But one entry, dated March 3rd, 1873, stopped Maya cold. I had the strangest conversation with Rose today. I was walking past her cottage and decided to visit her. I have not seen her much since Mother insists I am too old now to spend time with servants. Rose looked at me with such sadness. She asked if I was happy, if I was treated well. I told her of course I was happy. Then she said something very odd. "I'm glad you have had a good life, Miss Caroline. That is all I ever wanted for you." The way she said it, there was such emotion in her voice, almost as if she were my mother instead of mother being my mother. I have always felt a strange connection to Rose, though I cannot explain why. Maya set the diary down, her eyes filling with tears. Caroline had sensed something, some connection she could not quite define. And Rose. Rose had apparently remained nearby after emancipation, staying close to the daughter she could never acknowledge. Maya continued reading through the diary. There were several more mentions of Rose, always in the same vein, Caroline feeling drawn to her, noting Rose's intense interest in her welfare, puzzling over the unusual nature of their relationship. Then, in an entry from August 1874, Caroline wrote something that suggested she might have begun to suspect the truth. I was going through some of Mother's old letters today, looking for a recipe she had mentioned. I found a letter from Aunt Anne, dated 1858, that made reference to the circumstances of Caroline's arrival, and hoping that the deception would never be discovered. What deception? I asked Mother about it, but she became very upset and told me never to mention it again. She looked frightened. I do not understand what it could mean. Had Caroline ever discovered the full truth? Maya searched for any later writings, any letters or documents that might indicate Caroline had learned about her biological mother, but if Caroline had ever found out, she had left no record of it. Caroline lived until 1924, dying at age 66. Her obituary listed her survivors, her husband Henri, their 4 children, and numerous grandchildren. It mentioned her charitable works and her prominent role in New Orleans society. But there was no mention of Rose, no acknowledgement of the woman who had given birth to her. Maya found Caroline's death certificate. Cause of death, heart failure. But one detail caught her attention. The informant who had provided the information for the death certificate was listed as Marie Dufresne, daughter. Marie would have been Caroline's oldest child. Maya decided to try to find living descendants of Caroline. If she could locate family members and explain what she had discovered, perhaps they would agree to DNA testing that could confirm the biological relationship between Caroline and Rose. It would be difficult, uncomfortable even, to tell someone that their ancestor's identity was not what they had believed. But Maya felt she owed it to Rose to prove the truth. She started with Marie Dufresne, Caroline's daughter who had been listed on the death certificate. Tracing her descendants forward through marriage records, birth certificates, and obituaries was painstaking work, but after 2 weeks of research, Maya found a trail that led to present day. Marie had married a man named Thomas Arsenault and had 3 children. One of those children, a daughter named Claire, had remained in Louisiana. Claire's granddaughter, a woman named Jessica Arsenault, was still alive and living in Baton Rouge. Maya found Jessica's contact information and composed a carefully worded email explaining who she was and that she had made a discovery related to the Beaumont family history. She asked if Jessica would be willing to meet to discuss it. To her surprise, Jessica responded within hours, "Dr. Thompson, I would be very interested to meet with you. My grandmother used to tell me there were family secrets that had been buried for too long. I have always wanted to know the truth about our history, whatever it might be. Please let me know when you would like to meet." They arranged to meet the following Saturday at a coffee shop in Baton Rouge. Maya brought copies of the portrait, Caroline's diary entries, and Marguerite's letter. She was nervous about how Jessica would react to what she was about to reveal. Jessica Arsenault was a woman in her mid-40s, an attorney who specialized in civil rights cases. She arrived at the coffee shop precisely on time, carrying a leather folder. After they exchanged greetings and ordered coffee, Jessica opened the folder. "Before you show me what you have found, I want to show you something," Jessica said. "My grandmother gave this to me before she died. She said it had been passed down through the family for generations, and that someday I might understand why it was important." She pulled out a faded photograph and laid it on the table. Maya gasped. It was another image of Rose, this one from later in her life. Perhaps the 1880s, based on the style of dress and photography. Rose appeared to be in her 40s, her face showing the wear of hard years, but her eyes still held that same intensity Maya had noticed in the original portrait. "Who is this woman?" Jessica asked. "My grandmother would never tell me. She just said, 'Remember her? She matters.'" Maya's hands shook as she placed the 1858 portrait next to the later photograph. Her name was Rose, and I believe she was Caroline Beaumont's biological mother, which would make her your great-great-great-grandmother. Jessica stared at the photographs, then at Maya. "Tell me everything." For the next hour, Maya explained what she had discovered. She showed Jessica the documents, explained the historical context, described what life would have been like for an enslaved woman whose child had been taken and claimed by her enslavers. Jessica listened without interrupting, her expression moving from shock to anger to profound sadness. When Maya finished, Jessica was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, "I need to process this, but I also need to know if it is true, not just historically probable, but scientifically proven. Can we do DNA testing?" "That is what I was hoping you would say," Maya replied. "If we could find DNA from both Rose and Caroline, we could prove the biological relationship definitively. The problem is finding genetic material from people who died a century ago." Jessica thought for a moment. "Caroline is buried in Metairie Cemetery in New Orleans. I could petition for exhumation and DNA testing, though that would be expensive and legally complicated. Is there any other way?" Maya considered. "If we could find any descendants of Rose—" "Wait," Jessica interrupted. "You said Rose was still alive in the 1890 census. Did she have other children? Children she was able to keep?" Maya felt a surge of hope. She had been so focused on tracing Caroline's line that she had not thoroughly investigated whether Rose had other descendants. "I do not know, but I can find out." Maya returned to her research with renewed urgency. She went back through the census records more carefully, looking not just for Rose, but for any children who might have been living with her. In the 1880 census, she found what she had missed before. Rose was not listed as living alone. There was another entry in the household. Samuel, age 8, son. Maya's heart raced. Rose had another child, a son born around 1872, well after emancipation. She searched for more information about Samuel. In the 1900 census, she found him listed as Samuel Beaumont, age 28, working as a carpenter in New Orleans. He was married to a woman named Clara, and they had 2 children, Ruth, age 4, and Thomas, age 2. Maya traced Samuel's line forward through marriage records and city directories. He had lived in New Orleans his entire life, working as a carpenter and later establishing his own small construction business. He died in 1931, leaving behind 5 children who had survived to adulthood. Following the genealogical trail forward, Maya discovered that Samuel had numerous descendants still living in Louisiana. His great-grandson, a man named Marcus Beaumont, was a high school history teacher in New Orleans. Maya contacted Marcus and explained her research. Like Jessica, Marcus was immediately interested. "I have always known that our family descended from people who were enslaved at Belle Rive Plantation," he told Maya when they spoke on the phone. "My grandfather used to tell stories about his grandmother Rose. He said she was the strongest person he ever knew, that she had survived things he could not even imagine. But he never told me the details." "Would you be willing to participate in DNA testing?" Maya asked. "If you and Jessica Arsenault are both descended from Rose, and if Jessica is also descended from Caroline through the Beaumont-Dufresne line, the DNA would show a relationship that proves Rose was Caroline's mother." Absolutely," Marcus said without hesitation. "If this proves what you think it proves, it means my family history is connected to a white family that would never have acknowledged us. That matters. That needs to be documented." Maya arranged for both Jessica and Marcus to submit DNA samples to a genealogical testing company that specialized in identifying family relationships. The testing would take several weeks, but it would provide scientific proof or disproof the hypothesis that Rose was Caroline's biological mother. While waiting for the results, Maya continued researching Rose's life. She found property records showing that Rose had purchased her small house in 1872, saved enough money from her work as a laundress to buy land and a home of her own. That act of purchasing property, of establishing legal ownership over something, would have been profoundly meaningful for a woman who had herself been considered property for the first 19 years of her life. Maya found records of Rose attending Mount Zion Baptist Church in Lutcher. She found her name in Freedmen's Bureau records from 1866, listed among formerly enslaved people who were learning to read and write. Rose had been determined to claim every freedom that emancipation offered, to build a life on her own terms, and she had stayed close to Belle Reve, close to Caroline, even though she could not acknowledge their relationship, even though she had to watch her daughter grow up as someone else's child. Rose had remained nearby. Perhaps that proximity was its own form of motherhood, being close enough to watch over Caroline, to ensure she was safe and cared for, even if from a distance. The DNA results arrived 6 weeks after the samples were submitted. Maya opened the email with trembling hands, Jessica and Marcus both on a video call waiting to hear the results together. Maya read aloud, "The analysis confirms that Jessica Arsenault and Marcus Beaumont share a genetic relationship consistent with being third cousins once removed, sharing a common ancestor approximately 4 generations back. Additionally, Jessica's DNA shows ancestry that is approximately 18% African, which is consistent with having a great-great-great-grandparent who was of African descent." There was silence on the call. Then Jessica spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "So it is true. Caroline was Rose's daughter. My entire family history, everything I thought I knew about who I am. It is not what I believed." "It is exactly who you are," Marcus said gently. "You are descended from both Rose and Caroline. You carry both their stories in your DNA. That is not a loss, it is a gift. You get to claim Rose now. She is yours." Maya knew that the discovery would need to be shared carefully. This was not just a historical finding. It had implications for living people, for families who would need to reconsider their understanding of their own identities and histories. She worked with Jessica and Marcus to plan how to make the information public. They decided to hold a press conference at the New Orleans Museum of Southern History, where Maya would present the research findings, and both Jessica and Marcus would speak about what this discovery meant to them personally. The press conference was held on a Wednesday morning in November. The museum's lecture hall was filled with journalists, historians, genealogists, and members of both the Arsenault and Beaumont families. Maya had displayed the 1858 portrait prominently, enlarged so that Rose's expression was clearly visible to everyone in the room. Maya presented her findings systematically, the historical documents, the census records, the diary entries, and finally the DNA evidence. She explained the historical context of enslaved women whose children were taken and raised as white, the frequency with which this occurred, and why it had remained hidden for so long. Then Jessica spoke. "When Dr. Thompson first told me about this discovery, my initial reaction was shock. My family has identified as white for generations. We have benefited from that identity, from the privileges it conferred, even as we remained unaware of our true heritage. Learning that my great-great-great-grandmother was an enslaved woman who was separated from her own child, that my ancestor Caroline grew up never knowing her true mother, it has fundamentally changed how I understand myself and my place in this world. But I also feel an immense sense of responsibility. Rose's story was hidden, erased, denied for over 160 years. I am in a position now to ensure that she is finally acknowledged, that her existence and her pain and her love for her daughter are recognized. That is what I intend to do." Marcus spoke next. "My family has always known we descended from enslaved people at Belle Reve, but we did not know until now that we were connected to the Beaumont family not just through bondage, but through blood. Rose was my great-great-grandmother. She raised my great-grandfather Samuel after emancipation, worked hard to give him opportunities she never had, and all the while she was living just miles away from another child, a daughter she could never claim. The DNA evidence proves what Rose could never say out loud. Caroline was hers. And now finally, that truth is known. Jessica and I are cousins. We share Rose as an ancestor. And together, we are going to make sure Rose is remembered not as a nameless enslaved woman in the background of a portrait, but as a mother, a survivor, and a woman whose love transcended every barrier that was placed in her way." The press conference generated significant media coverage. The story appeared in newspapers across the country, was featured on historical podcasts, and sparked conversations about hidden histories and the lasting impact of slavery. The portrait of the Beaumont family, with Rose standing behind Caroline with that expression of desperate longing, became an iconic image, a visual representation of the thousands of enslaved mothers who had been separated from their children. But for Maya, the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. 3 weeks after the press conference, she received a letter postmarked from Baton Rouge. Inside was a single piece of paper, yellowed with age, covered in careful handwriting. The letter began, "My name is Rose. I'm writing this in the year 1890, and I do not know if anyone will ever read these words. But I need to tell my story, to leave some record of the truth, even if it must remain hidden for years to come." Maya's hands trembled as she read Rose's words, written more than a century earlier. The letter had been enclosed in a second envelope with a note from a woman named Patricia Chen, a genealogist in Baton Rouge. "Dr. Thompson," the note read, "after seeing the news coverage of your research, I remembered this letter. It has been in my family's possession for 4 generations. My great-great-grandmother was a woman named Clara Beaumont. She was married to Samuel, Rose's son. Clara told my great-grandmother that Rose had given her this letter shortly before Rose died, with instructions that it should be kept safe and passed down through the family. Rose said that someday someone would need to know the truth, and the letter would serve as her testimony. I believe that time has come. Please read Rose's words and share them if you think it is appropriate." Maya sat down and read the letter in its entirety. "My name is Rose. I was born in 1839 on Belle Plantation in St. James Parish, Louisiana. I was enslaved from birth. My mother died when I was 8 years old, and I was raised in the house of Charles Beaumont, working as a house servant from the time I was old enough to carry water and sweep floors. When I was 18 years old, Mr. Charles began to force himself upon me. I had no ability to refuse him. I was his property, and he could do with me as he wished. This continued for several months, and in early 1858 I discovered I was carrying his child. I was terrified. I knew what happened to enslaved women who bore their masters' children. Sometimes the children were sold away, sometimes they were kept as slaves alongside their mothers, sometimes they were freed, though this was rare. I did not know what would happen to my baby. When Mrs. Marguerite learned I was pregnant, she came to speak with me privately. She told me that she and Mr. Charles had been unable to have children of their own, and that if my baby was born with light skin, they would take the child and raise it as their own. She said the child would have every advantage: education, wealth, a position in society. She said this as if she were offering me a gift. I begged her not to take my baby. I told her I would do anything, work any amount, but please let me keep my child. She looked at me with something like pity and said, "Rose, you must understand. A child raised as a slave has no future, but a child raised as my daughter will have everything. Would you deny your baby that opportunity because of your own selfish desire to keep it?" What could I say to that? She had twisted my love for my unborn child into selfishness, had made it seem as though I was the one harming my baby by wanting to keep it. My daughter was born on May 15th, 1858. She came into this world with pale skin and light hair, and I knew immediately that I would lose her. They let me hold her for one day to memorize her face, her smell, the sound of her cry. Then Mrs. Marguerite took her from my arms and said, "Her name is Caroline. You will serve as her nursemaid, but you must never tell her the truth. She will grow up believing she is my daughter, and you will never interfere with that belief." For the next 7 years, I cared for my own daughter while pretending to be merely her servant. I changed her clothes, fed her, sang to her, soothed her when she cried. But I could never hold her the way a mother holds her child. I could never tell her I loved her. I could never claim her as mine. When the war ended and we were freed, I thought about leaving, about going north and starting a new life far from Belle Reve. But I could not leave Caroline. She was 7 years old, and she knew me only as Rose, the woman who took care of her. How could I abandon my daughter, even if she did not know I was her mother? So I stayed nearby. I bought a small house on land that had once been a part of the plantation. I worked as a laundress, and I watched Caroline grow up from a distance. Sometimes she would visit me, and I treasured those visits more than she could ever know. I watched her become a young woman, watched her marry, watched her have children of her own. My grandchildren, though they will never know me as such. In 1872, I had another child, a son I named Samuel. Samuel's father was a good man, a freedman who worked on the railroad. We were together for 3 years before he was killed in an accident. But Samuel was mine to keep, mine to raise, mine to love openly. And I did love him with all my heart. But even as I raised Samuel, part of my heart was always with Caroline, the daughter I could never claim. I'm writing this now because I am old and my health is failing. I do not know how much longer I have. I want there to be some record somewhere that tells the truth. Caroline Beaumont was my daughter. I gave birth to her. I loved her. And I spent my entire life watching her from the shadows, unable to be her mother in any way that mattered. If anyone ever reads this letter, please know that I did the best I could. I survived bondage, survived losing my child, survived a war that destroyed everything I had known. I built a new life in freedom, raised my son Samuel with all the love I had been unable to give Caroline. I stayed close to my daughter even when I could not acknowledge her, because being near her was better than being away from her. To whoever finds this letter, please remember me. Please remember that I existed, that I mattered, that my love for my daughter was real, even though it could never be spoken. Do not let my story be forgotten. Rose Beaumont, October 12th, 1890. Maya finished reading with tears streaming down her face. She had known that someday someone would need to understand what had happened. And she had left this testimony, this final act of claiming her daughter and her own truth. Maya immediately contacted Jessica and Marcus to share Rose's letter. Reading Rose's own words, hearing her voice across more than a century, transformed the historical discovery into something far more personal and profound. "We need to honor her," Jessica said after reading the letter, "not just by acknowledging what happened to her, but by creating something permanent, something that ensures Rose is remembered." Together with Marcus and several other descendants from both the Arsenault and Beaumont families, they began planning a memorial. They decided it should be located near where Belle Rive Plantation had once stood, in St. James Parish. The memorial would consist of a bronze statue depicting Rose holding an infant, the one day she had been allowed to hold Caroline before her daughter was taken from her. Alongside the statue would be a plaque containing Rose's own words from her letter and a historical marker explaining the practice of wealthy white families claiming the children of enslaved women. The project took 18 months to complete, requiring fundraising, design work, and coordination with local authorities. Throughout the process, more descendants of Rose came forward, people who had heard about the research and realized they were connected to this history. Some were descended from Samuel's line, while others traced their ancestry to Rose's siblings and cousins who had also been enslaved at Belle Rive. The memorial dedication was held on May 15th, 2294, exactly 166 years after Caroline's birth. More than 300 people attended, including historians, community members, and dozens of Rose's descendants. Jessica and Marcus both spoke, as did Maya, sharing the research that had uncovered Rose's story. But the most powerful moment came when Rose's descendants, both those who had grown up knowing they were descended from enslaved people and those, like Jessica, who had only recently learned about their African ancestry, gathered together around the statue. They represented 6 generations since Rose's time, and they came in every shade of skin color, reflecting the complex racial history of Louisiana in the South. An elderly woman named Dorothy, one of Samuel's great-granddaughters, spoke on behalf of the family. Rose survived the worst that human cruelty could inflict. She lost her freedom, her dignity, and her daughter, but she also survived, built a life, raised my grandfather with love and strength, and now, because of Dr. Thompson's research and because Rose was brave enough to write down her truth, we can finally acknowledge her properly. We can say her name. We can honor her love for Caroline, even though that love was never allowed to be spoken during her lifetime. Jessica added, "I grew up believing I was descended only from wealthy white planters. I never imagined I carried the blood of an enslaved woman, that my entire family history was built on a lie. Learning about Rose has been difficult. It has forced me to reconsider everything I thought I knew about my identity and my privilege. But it has also been a gift. Rose is my ancestor just as much as Charles and Marguerite Beaumont are. And I am honored to claim her, to ensure her story is told, and to work toward a world where such cruelties are never repeated." The memorial was unveiled, a beautiful bronze statue showing Rose in the one moment she had been allowed to hold her newborn daughter, her expression captured in a mix of love and anguish. The plaque beside it read, "Rose, 1839-1891, enslaved at Belle Rive. Plantation mother of Caroline Beaumont, 1858-1924. Her love transcended bondage. Her truth survived silence. Please remember me. Please remember that I existed, that I mattered, that my love for my daughter was real, even though it could never be spoken." From Rose's letter, 1890. 6 months after the memorial dedication, Maya stood in her office at the museum looking at the original 1858 portrait that had started everything. The image had been professionally restored and now hung in a place of prominence in the museum's permanent collection, accompanied by a comprehensive exhibition about Rose's life, the practice of wealthy families claiming enslaved women's children, and the ongoing work of uncovering hidden histories. The exhibition had become one of the museum's most visited, drawing people from across the country who wanted to understand this aspect of American history that had been deliberately hidden for so long. School groups came regularly, and Maya had developed educational materials to help teachers discuss the difficult topics the exhibition raised. But perhaps the most significant impact had been on the families themselves. Jessica and Marcus had become close friends, united by their shared connection to Rose. Together, they had established a foundation to support genealogical research for African American families, helping others uncover their own hidden histories. Jessica had also made significant changes in her personal life. She had begun actively working on racial justice issues, using her position as an attorney to advocate for policies that addressed historical injustices. "Learning about Rose changed everything for me," she told Maya. "I can't just acknowledge this history and then go back to living as I did before. I have a responsibility to do better, to work toward repairing some of the harm that was done." Marcus had incorporated Rose's story into his history curriculum, using it as a way to help his students understand the human reality behind historical abstractions like slavery and racial injustice. When students see that photograph of Rose looking at Caroline, When they read Rose's letter, it becomes real to them in a way that textbook descriptions never could, he explained. They understand that these were real people, real families torn apart by an evil system. Maya had written a book about her research titled Rose's Daughter, An Enslaved Mother's Hidden Legacy. The book had been well received, winning several awards for historical scholarship and generating discussions about how many similar stories remained hidden in family collections and archives across the South. But beyond the academic recognition, Maya felt she had accomplished something more important. She had given Rose a voice. For 133 years after her death, Rose's story had remained hidden, her truth suppressed, her love for her daughter unacknowledged. Now, finally, people knew. They knew about Rose's pain and her strength, about Caroline's hidden origins, about the cruelty of a system that separated mothers from their children and then forced those mothers to serve as caretakers while pretending they were merely servants. On the anniversary of Rose's death, November 3rd, 1891, Maya, Jessica, and Marcus visited the memorial together. They brought flowers and stood in silence for a few moments, each reflecting on how Rose's story had changed their lives. "Do you think Caroline ever found out?" Jessica asked quietly. "Do you think she ever knew Rose was her mother?" "I don't know," Maya replied. "We may never know. But I hope that somehow, somewhere, Caroline understood. I hope she felt that connection Rose tried so hard to maintain across all those barriers." Marcus added, "What matters now is that we know. We can honor Rose. We can tell her story. We can make sure that she is remembered not just as a footnote in someone else's history, but as a complete human being, a mother, a survivor, a woman whose love was stronger than the chains that bound her." As they stood together by the memorial, Maya thought about the portrait that had started it all, that 1858 image of a plantation family posing for a photograph. For more than 150 years, people had looked at that portrait and seen only what they expected to see, a wealthy white family and their servant. They had not looked closely at Rose's eyes, had not noticed the expression of longing and pain, had not questioned why a nursemaid would be positioned so close to the family, her body angled protectively toward the child. But Maya had looked closely. She had seen what others had missed, and in doing so, she had uncovered a truth that demanded to be told. The portrait now hung in the museum with a new label, one that told the complete story. The Beaumont family, 1858, Charles and Marguerite Beaumont with their daughter Caroline, and Rose, Caroline's biological mother. This photograph documents one of the many ways enslaved families were torn apart. Rose gave birth to Caroline but was never allowed to be her mother in any meaningful way. She spent her life watching her daughter from the shadows, her love unacknowledged and her truth suppressed. This image serves as a reminder that behind every historical photograph, there are hidden stories waiting to be discovered and told. As visitors to the museum stood before the portrait, many found themselves drawn to Rose's eyes, those eyes that had held their truth for over 160 years, waiting for someone to finally see and understand. And now, at last, people were seeing, they were understanding, and they were remembering. Rose's story, hidden for so long, had finally been told. Her voice, silenced for more than a century, was finally being heard. And her love for her daughter, the love she had never been allowed to speak, was finally being acknowledged and honored. It was not justice. Nothing could undo what had been done to Rose. Could not give her back the years with Caroline, could not erase her pain, but it was recognition. It was remembrance, and it was a promise that her story would never be forgotten again.